puppetry as an art form, well, it's hard to say when it first began, because people talk about cavemen even using puppetry and shadow puppetry as a type of art form to tell stories. So really puppetry is as old as time. You know, puppetry is taking an inanimate object and bringing it to life. And so, you know, this has gone on for hundreds of centuries. I think the primary use of puppetry is for storytelling, and of course that just will never change. In fact, marionettes were originally built to tell Bible stories in church back in the days when only the rich people could afford Bibles because they were written by hand. The poor people were told Bible stories with puppets on strings called Little Marys. And that's where the name marionette comes from. Puppetry has a wide and varied history. Of course, you know, the Punch and Judy shows are very famous, and then they can be used in as ways of in political means as well. For example, in more modern times, there was a company called Spitting Image that did a whole satirical show about politics and world events, and this was. This is a version of their Reagan puppet that you know it's been used in types of protest. The Bread and Puppet Company had built these giant puppets to protest the Vietnam War. But it's that sort of thing, you know. There's stories of days of old where the puppeteer would protest the king and queen from inside the puppet house, and you know, this sort of can be used as anarchy, and it can be something to tell a beautiful story as well.
In 1947, a Nashville native named Tom Tichenor was hired as a puppeteer by the Nashville Public Library. There, Tichenor created many marionette shows and storytime performances that were held in the mornings. In 1950, Tom created Wormwood Forest, a show that broadcasted on WSM radio. In one episode, Tichenor's hero Walt Disney guest starred on the program. In 1961, Tom moved to New York City, where he began to build puppets for the hit Broadway musical Carnival. In 1992, Tom Tichenor passed away after suffering a stroke. Today, Tichenor's legacy lives on through the works of Wishing Chair Productions. Led by Brian Hull, the company continues to create new shows using Tom's marionettes, as well as storytime performances at the library.
Well, I started out working at Opryland as a performer, and then went on to create this professor character. As you see, I'm still the professor here at the library doing the puppet shows and story times, and that is what directed me into children's entertainment and children's programming. And then about 14 years ago, this position opened up at the library, and I initially was not a puppeteer, although I had read a lot about puppetry and I had done some puppetry, but not on such a large scale as what we do here. So initially I was hired to create some new shows for the old Tichenor puppets. That was sort of the place to start with this job, and so that's what I did, and just sort of worked with marionettes, and then discovered new and other types of puppetry and explored that with Bunraku and shadow puppetry, and it just expanded and has grown and grown and grown, and is still growing after all these years.
Well, I actually just sort of got thrown right into it. I was acting and performing as a children's entertainer at theme parks for quite a while, and I saw that the opportunity had come up here at the library for a puppeteer, and thought it would be fun, and some of my abilities would lend themselves well to puppetry, so I just sort of just started doing it. I'd only done a little bit of puppetry before I'd started here, which is what at the Birmingham Children's Theater. I was the cow for the Jack and the Beanstalk production. That was a giant puppet. I was inside the entire. I was inside of the cow, so it was a sort of a giant, big walk-around puppet.
I started doing puppets when I started working here at the library about 6 years ago. So I had really not worked with puppets at all before then. I was an actor, a film and television and a theater actor for about 25 years before I started working here.
I think one of my early influences was a fellow named Ernie Kovacs, who had a television show in the 50s. And he was not a puppeteer, but he taught me a lot in the sort of style of his performance, where he sort of had this no apologies type of performing. He did things, he tried things, sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't, but he would try things, and it was always very unusual and very, and still to this day, you know, groundbreaking and incredible. And then some stuff didn't work, but he was sort of an inspiration.
Well, for puppetry specifically, I would have to say Brian Hull. He showed me how to work the puppets and how they are operated and built. I really like the European style of puppetry, where you get to see the puppeteer the whole time. And you know, I guess as far as being able to perform with a puppet, the acting and performance skills that go into it are, you know, are something that go way back as far as being a child watching Sesame Street and the Electric Company and the Muppets and things like that. I always liked Dick Van Dyke and John Ritter and Carol Burnett. Roger Miller are some of the inspirations for puppetry, just because of their creative expressions of what they offered. So pretty big range of influences.
A lot of different people, influences in acting. There was a woman named Ruth Sweet from here in Nashville, who I'm sure knew Tom Tichenor, who ran the National Children's Theater. She was a big inspiration. For puppets, though, I have to say my peers. We've learned over the years here with some of the Europeans that we've come in contact with, European puppeteers. I've learned a lot from them. Phillip Huber, and a lot of just young puppeteers who are just enthusiastic about what they're doing.
Wishing Chair Productions has over 350 marionettes that are contained in a storage room. Let's take a look at some of these marionettes.
Okay, this is a Tom Tichenor puppet, a pretty famous one that's very significant. His name is Jerome the Gnome, and it's a pretty nice little puppet here. This is when Tom was still making the hard shell heads and hands. He eventually moved on to just cloth, but this is Jerome the Gnome. This is Marco Polo Bear, also a very well-known puppet that Tom used quite a bit. And Marco Polo Bear is a marionette, and he's all a cloth. So very good looking, you know, of course with the fur, and he's got the notorious costume. He's always got the, he changed his costume a lot, but Marco Polo Bear was one of Tom's special puppets. And he's right here. He's very cool. Here's another Tichenor puppet that we use quite a bit, and this is our Cinderella puppet. This is Cinderella before the fairy godmother gets to visit her. Now there's another puppet right here that is also Cinderella, and you can see that she's got the exact same face. It's the same character, but it's a different puppet. And so it's just easier when you're operating a puppet, rather than changing her clothes, it's easier to just bring out a whole new puppet. So this is an original Tom Tichenor puppet, and this is also an original Tom Tichenor puppet, but the dress has been updated. Jennifer Klein made this costume for her. And then behind her here are the rest of the characters for our production of Cinderella. These are all Tichenor puppets. You can see you've got the page and a couple of the stepsisters and the stepmother, and then the fairy godmother's back here in the back.
Now let's take a look at one of these characters and see how it was created. Here's Jim Smiley, a puppet character used for one of Wishing Chair Productions' shows.
Well, Jim Smiley is a rod puppet, and so I started with the rod here, the main rod. This white piece of PVC plastic goes all the way up inside of his head, and here underneath the costume is some foam that was carved out to sort of give the indication of the chest and the abdomen area. The head is made out of a liquid plastic, a pourable plastic, that when it cools and dries, it hardens really nicely and can be drilled into and cut, and it still holds up a good sturdy form. The head was poured into a mold which was made from a clay sculpture. Once the sculpture is complete, it's put into a container, and then the liquid rubber is poured all over it, and when that dries, you take the clay out of the rubber and then you pour in this liquid plastic. When it cools, then you have the final product here that can be painted, and hair was glued on. Now he's got, the hands are made out of the same thing as the head. If you can see right here, on the back of the hand I carved out a little groove so that when the little bit of metal that goes up in there is hooked to the pin that I put through the top to the bottom of the hand, it gives a little bit of a hinging motion, which allows for a little more fluid motion there. In between his wrist and his shoulder is a piece of chain which allows him to have the elbow movement and the rotation of the shoulder. Now, of course, the puppeteer has to operate both of Jim Smiley's hands with only one of his own because he's also got to hold up the rod in the middle. This was a team effort. You know, Jim Smiley was made by several people. I put the mechanics together on the arms and the wrists, and I constructed the main inner workings, but we had other team members involved with the head sculpting and the hands. Adrian Rose and Mary Bailey. Jennifer Klein made the costumes, and I think Mary also painted the face, and I think Brian Hull did a little bit of the artwork here also, and it's Brian's original design as far as the look of the puppet goes. So quite a team effort there.
Here's a look at some puppet shows and programs by Wishing Chair Productions. The members of Wishing Chair Productions are not the only puppeteers in the Nashville, Middle Tennessee area. Master puppeteer Ed James told his story of how he got his start in puppetry.
My dad went on a trip to Mexico, and while he was down there he picked up 3 Mexican puppets for my brother, my sister, and myself, and within 24 hours I had talked to my brother and sister into selling their puppets to me for 50 cents a piece. I loved collecting marionettes, and so I started collecting Mexican puppets when I was just 8 years old. By the time I was 11, I had probably had 50 or 60 puppets. So collecting was a big thing I did when I was a kid. For a period of time I worked for Animax Designs and Chuck Fawcett. We worked on puppet characters for Disney World and Tokyo Disney during that period of time. I learned a lot. He is a brilliant puppet maker and understands design and proportion really well. In that kind of a setting, he's the director, he's the producer, and so puppet makers and puppet builders work underneath him in designing those shows for Disney. Animax Designs is a specialty puppet construction studio. They specialize in technologies that deal with high-end puppets. They have built characters for Disney World that are used not only in their live shows with audiences, but the characters have also appeared on floats in the Disney parades. Animax also produces characters for commercial television and commercial branding of products. An example of that is the little bear from the fabric softener company. When I was younger, I had trained with Linnea Lindsay, and she and her husband Hal were part of the Tony Sarg Marionette Company out of New York City. Tony Sarg helped create the original Macy's Day balloons for the Thanksgiving Day Parade that we see on national TV every year. And that group of people introduced me to the Puppeteers of America, which is a network of professional puppeteers, amateurs, and collectors. So I mentored underneath a lot of those professionals during that time in Dallas, Texas. Through that organization, I got to meet Jim Henson, when he was alive, from the Muppets and Sesame Street. Carol Spinney, who plays the part of Oscar the Grouch in Big Bird. He used to write me letters on the holidays when I was a kid. Bill Baird, who created the Marionettes for Sound of Music, was also one of the puppeteers that I met when I was growing up. Currently, Puppetry is a part of my event design company with a project called Light the World Parade, which is a cultural outreach we've designed for youth and young adults to do at major sports events, entertainment events, like the Olympic Games, the World Cup Soccer, the Super Bowl. We're going to be using backpack puppets, marionettes, and rod characters in our parade performance, designed much like the Disney parades that you see in the afternoons at Walt Disney World and Disneyland.
Here's an interview with multi-talented master puppeteer Phillip Huber, who has been affiliated with the arts community in Nashville. Phillip Huber's passion for the art of puppetry is evident in his extensive career in film, television, live stage, and other ventures in the entertainment industry.
My start came very young. My mother gave me a puppet when I was only 3 years old, and she noticed that I was very shy, and she thought it would help me express myself. So she gave me a small hand puppet dog, and that was the start of a collection of hand puppets. It continued on until I was about 11 years old, where I became more interested in the marionettes. And from that point on, I wanted something more complicated, more challenging, and so I continued on working with the marionettes and then turned professional by the age of 15. Puppetry is a symbolic art form. It shows symbolisms, and it relates to human mythology and our interest in fantasy and things like that. And puppets can represent anything or anyone. And so they don't have to be humanistic, they can be animalistic, or they can be totally inanimate objects that suddenly take on life forms. And I think that's fascinating. Puppetry early on was for all ages, and in some countries it even predated live theater. In India, the term for stage manager is translated as string puller, which suggests that there were puppets on stage before there were live actors there. But once puppetry became popular in the 50s, I would say, in the United States on television with shows like Howdy Doody, people started to just think in terms of, okay, we use puppets as a babysitting tool. And once that happened, then they stopped looking at puppetry as a part of theatrical art form and looked at it more as just a plaything that comes to life. I moved to Tennessee about 10 years ago, and my connection to Nashville is just that I have a lot of good friends there that work in puppetry, specifically at the downtown library, which has a great puppetry department. So I've gotten to know people there, and they've produced 2 different festivals, one an international puppet festival about 4 years ago, and then just this year they performed put together another festival, and both times they had me come and perform, and that's the first time I've actually been able to perform in this area. Usually all the demand for my performances are internationally for festivals in many different countries, or else I'm working on cruise ships all over the world as well. Right now I'm working on a film for Disney, and part of the technology there is that I will be working a marionette to create the performance of a certain character in the film. But actually what will happen is it will be translated into a computer-generated character, but they're using the performance of the marionette. And I think you can marry a lot of different technologies together. Puppetry itself is very low-tech, and when combined with the very high-tech, you get interesting effects. And I would hope that would happen, but I will hope, too, that puppetry will always stay alive as a theatrical art form where people can go and experience it one-on-one. And I think that's some of its strongest aspects still, and hopefully will be far into the future.
Delighting and engaging audiences of all ages throughout history, puppetry is very much alive as an authentic art form. Since Nashville is a major center for the arts, It is a natural place for puppetry to thrive alongside music and affiliated theatrical and visual arts. Come and enjoy.
Puppetry cannot be replaced by anything else. Puppetry has been around, as we said, for centuries and centuries, since the beginning of time, probably. And it's unique in itself. There's a saying that actors act and puppets are. In other words, that's not an actress playing Cinderella. It is Cinderella. It's a very pure form of storytelling. The character represented becomes the definitive character. And it uses all these different disciplines and styles of art. It uses music, it uses theater, it uses sculpting, it's painting. It draws from all of these different things to create. And of course then you have the story that is most important of all put together and presented in a way that nothing can replace it. Not television, not film, not even live theater. Puppetry is its own unique art form.